How bad would the US economy be without the government? Well, we're about to find out. And it's a pertinent question to ask given that demand destruction is becoming more visible all over again. As you no doubt have heard, the federal government has gone completely insane, borrowing boatloads of cash. What you may not know is where all that cash has ended up. The scale of redistribution that's been taking place isn't just off the charts, it's a different planet. And that's not past tense either. The transfers didn't stop in 2021. Now, the consequences are enormous beyond strictly the amounts that are being borrowed by Uncle Sam. What does this mean for the economy in 2024 that is once again, as I mentioned, showing clear signs of even more demand destruction? And to that last point, the latest figures from the government show a sharp drop off in gasoline demand right here in April. We've talked about what's prolonging the cycle. Well, this is a big one. And even when we factor what's happening here, especially as these transfers are winding down, we still end up with the cycle. Uncle Sam couldn't buy a recovery. As I said, the amounts taking place here are just absolutely staggering. You can't comprehend these figures, especially in the short space of time that they've happened, even after the last 15 years where we continue to break through all historical and traditional barriers one after another after another. The numbers just get so big, it's hard to distinguish any type of scale within them. But we're going to try that anyway. Let's set the stage by figuring out just how much is going on here. First of all, the amount of federal government debt. Total public federal debt has increased by 10.8 trillion since the first quarter of 2020. So the second quarter, the lockdowns, the pandemic, all of that stuff. Ever since then, the amount of total public federal debt has increased by just shy of 11 trillion. And that's not even 4 years. That's just completely crazy amount. And of course, 2.5 trillion of that was just last year, not even the whole year last year. It was just the final 3 quarters of last year. So 2.5 trillion just last year. That's one reason why the US economy appears to be invulnerable. But we need to understand the details behind that invulnerability. It's not just the federal government spending and financing conflicts around the world or buying off voters as politicians always want to do. There's something more economic about what's happening with federal government debt. Redistribution is a huge part of this. So when I'm talking about redistribution, let's start with government social benefits to persons, which in the pandemic era with things like unemployment aid that just went crazy, as well as the helicopter payments. What we see when we look at government social benefits to persons is that there's typically a big jump around recessions and contractions. The bigger the contraction, the more there is aid from, this is basically the social safety net. So we see a huge jump in government transfers, government social benefits to persons in 2008, and of course another again in 2020. So what we're going to do to measure the scale, we're going to draw a baseline from 2012 to the end of 2019. And then we're going to see in the 2020s how much transfer payments, how many of these government social benefits are in excess of that baseline. That'll give us a sense of just how much additional aid that's been offered through these government channels. And remember, keep in mind here, the estimates that the BEA gives us are seasonally adjusted annual rates. So you can't just total these up and subtract off the baseline. So just to give us a rough sense of what's happening, we're going to take the seasonally adjusted annual rates, we'll do our math, and then we'll divide by 4. Again, we're not trying to be precise here. We're not trying to be perfectly accurate. And given the scale of the problem that we're seeing, given the scale of these numbers, we don't need to be. So we tally up the government social benefits to persons that were in excess of that 2012 to 2019 baseline. The raw amount was 10.8 trillion. But again, that's a seasonally adjusted annual rates tallied together. We can't do that. So we'll just divide by 4 to give us something, what we hope is closer to the real money that was transferred. It's about 2.7 trillion in excess payments, not total payments, just excess payments above the pre-pandemic baseline. But of that 2.7 trillion, 1.6 trillion was in the immediate lockdown overreaction period. That's the second quarter of 2020 through the first quarter of 2021. But as you'll notice, that still leaves 1.1 trillion in excess government social benefit payments since 2021. So over the last couple years, about 1.1 trillion, the government has still been paying out social benefits in excess of its previous baseline, all the way through last year. And just last year alone, the excess payments tallied about 259 billion. So that's a lot of additional social benefits being paid out on top of what would have happened had there never been this increase in aid. But that's just government social benefits to persons. There's actually other transfers that have taken place too. While those social benefits made up the vast majority of government transfers in 2020 and 2021, there have been other transfers that have been made in the years since, and substantial transfers that have kept up 2022 and 2023. So let's look at total current transfer payments from the federal government to various actors in the real economy. But this is not just to persons either. There are also payments to businesses. So this total current transfer payments also includes all the numbers that we just went in, the social benefits to persons. So this is the bigger subset of the entire transfer system, the redistribution effort taking place at the federal government. And so again, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to draw a baseline from 2012 to 2019, and then we're going to roughly calculate the excess transfer payments over and above that baseline. And over the last not quite 4 years, that amounts to 12.6 trillion. So about $1.5 trillion, a little more than $1.5 trillion above the social benefit payments. 12.6 trillion will divide by 4 for a rough guess of about 3.2 trillion in real money excess payments in the 3+ years. About 1.7 trillion of that was the first pandemic period, second quarter of 2020 through the first quarter of 2021. And that's really basically the same as the amount of social benefits. So there have been a lot more transfer payments after 2021, after the first quarter of 2021, than strictly paid out in social benefits. That number is 1.5 trillion, about $0.5 trillion, almost $0.5 trillion more in total transfers than strictly social benefits to persons. And just 2023, just last year alone, the total number of excess transfer payments was 436 billion. Again, rough guess, not an exact number, but when you're talking about close to $0.5 trillion, we don't have to be exact. All of this money that's being transferred from the federal government is being borrowed from the marketplace. Essentially, it's being borrowed from hedge funds that are engaged in the basis trade that are funding the government. So we have private savings that are being transferred through the government to other people who are then largely spending this in the real economy. So we're funneling money from savings into the real economy for reasons that have nothing to do with the economy. That's the problem here. In addition to that being the problem, we also should notice that the transfer payments are slowing down last year. Not only are they slowing down, they have been slowing down so that we're going to be back to the baseline pretty soon, which means the excess payments from the government are drying up. So what happens to the economy once that happens? Now, Keynesian economists will say nothing. This economy will keep booming because this is what's supposed to happen. They even have a name for it, a term for it. They call it automatic stabilizers. And the automatic stabilizers, the social safety net, is supposed to kick in when the economy gets weak. And it's supposed to lead to the virtuous cycle of recovery. More spending, even if it's financed by the government, more spending leads to businesses having more revenue, which then means they hire more workers and invest more, which leads to more spending and then more workers and more investing, and on we go. So from the Keynesian theory, the automatic stabilizers are supposed to help fill in the trough of the recession at the same time as they lead to the recovery. But as you can see, that didn't happen in 2008. And you could say, yeah, there are different circumstances in 2008 that prevented that, but the automatic stabilizers, maybe they did save a few jobs, maybe they did fill in some of the trough, but they did not lead to recovery. In fact, you could also argue they hindered the recovery by introducing these non-economic, non-sustainable factors that eventually have to be worked through. The economy needs to find a stable equilibrium, which the government is trying to avoid. Furthermore, in 2022, 23, and now 2024, We see that the US economy is already falling behind as it is, despite these massive excess payments, redistribution payments from the federal government. It hasn't been enough to keep up with price changes. In real terms, statistics like disposable personal income show you that incomes overall, which include these transfer payments, have not kept up with price changes. So they haven't been able to buy a recovery. At the same time, the redistributions that are taking place helped create those price changes in the first place. When you look at the economy in real terms, there has been this excess of payments and transfers and everything else from the federal government, but it hasn't been able to buy a recovery. So it's still completely unstable. The situation in the US is entirely unstable, and therefore what these transfers are doing is nothing more than prolonging the process of trying to find that new stable equilibrium after so many years of distortions. There's a continuous distortion in the economy. And this is something I talked about just recently too. Make a comparison to Europe, because Europe shows maybe what the US economy would have looked like with fewer excess transfers, not necessarily no excess transfers, but fewer excess transfers, especially in 2022 and 2023. Europe is suffering the downside of the supply shock, and it's more visible there than it is here. You look at European GDP, that slowed down in the first half of 2022, then fell into recession in the final quarter of 2022 and basically stayed there throughout last year, and it doesn't look like it's going to get out this year, despite the fact that there's a little bit of a disinflation rebound in some of the sentiment indicators right now. There was that last year too, and it didn't help Europe avoid further recession. So Europe is in a recession, even though it hasn't been declared. Flat real GDP growth is a contraction, and it's a pretty substantial one the longer you go, and a year and a half is a long time to go in that state. So maybe that's what the US economy looks like without all of these massive transfers. Though you can also make the case the US would have been a whole lot worse had it not been for those transfers. And again, the economists and policymakers will say, well, yeah, but that's the point. We don't want the US to look like Europe. We want the US to look better than what the US looks like. So the transfers were helping keep the US out of recession. So how could that possibly be a bad thing? But it's like driving your car's engine even faster once the check engine light comes on. Because what you really need to do is pull over, stop driving, and maybe undertake some costly repairs. You don't just stick the gas pedal to the floor and hope everything works out. You end up moving at basically the same speed anyway, but you're creating problems for you, your real big problems that you're going to have to solve further down the road. That's what's happening with all these transfers. It doesn't create the virtuous cycle because real economies depend upon economic factors to lead to sustainable wealth creation. You don't just spend for the sake of spending. Yes, that can create some short-term activity, but you're just pushing things further out into the future. You're pushing adjustments that need to be made, and big adjustments that need to be made after the last several years of massive distortions throughout the economy. So they're prolonging a cycle that is still, at the end of the day, a cycle. So we would have looked more like Europe, and maybe it would have been better if we looked worse than Europe, if we had experienced the actual recession. If we had pulled over the car in 2022 and allowed everything to settle and fix. Yes, it would have been painful. Yes, it would have been uncomfortable, especially for politicians. But in the long run, it would have paid off, especially in 2024, 2 years later. Can you imagine what a real recovery would have looked like after this amount of time had passed in between? And this whole argument is given new urgency by what I talked about in the introduction. More demand destruction thanks to the non-economic imposition of crude oil prices. Yesterday, I went over the effects on especially the services part of the U.S. economy. You saw that in PMIs. In fact, S&P Global Services PMI is basically almost perfectly inverse to the price of oil. Price of oil goes up, services sector suffers. Price of oil comes down because inevitably enough demand gets destroyed. Services start to rebound, but they never get back to where they were before. So it's this ratcheting effect where the economy takes more and more damage through time. And we're, of course, going through one right now, this inverse cycle. Oil prices have been high, especially February, March, and in parts of April. They've backed down a little bit. Gasoline prices for both oil as well as seasonal factors. And of course, the services economy now showing signs of slowing down, which should not be unexpected. We're seeing demand destruction there. But we're also seeing it more directly in the energy sector itself, especially gasoline. According to the Energy Information Administration, the U.S. government's agency that keeps track of these things, demand for gasoline has fallen off sharply. Imagine that, yet again in April. According to their figures for gasoline supplied, which is a proxy for demand or amount that's used, as of the latest numbers that just came out today, gasoline supplied is tied with April of 2022 for the weakest outside of the lockdowns. And April 2022 is in the immediate aftermath of the massive gasoline and oil price spike. We're about 500,000 barrels per day below what would be considered normal for this time of year. So demand destruction in gasoline is happening. It's happening in petroleum too. Look at petroleum supplied. That's about 19.5 million barrels per day. The 8-week average is about 20 million barrels per day, which is about the same as last year, which was not nearly enough, reflecting economic weakness throughout the U.S. economy and the rest of the world. Why do you think OPEC had to cut back on supply? And that level for petroleum supplied is about the same as 2022, like gasoline, when demand actually plummeted after the big price spike. It's way below pre-pandemic 2018 and 2019. So demand destruction and everything else, we can see it happening in the energy sector, as well as the early stages of it again in the real economy. So the key factors that are prolonging the cycle have been labor hoarding, that's part of it, but also these massive amounts of government transfers, the redistribution for non-economic reasons from the savings through the treasury market into the federal government's coffers, then out into the real economy in excess transfers, the scale of which we can't even comprehend. And even despite those massive amounts of transfers, the U.S. economy is still suffering. It's barely clicking along here. It isn't and hasn't been as bad as Europe, but that's not really a good standard for comparison. Uncle Sam has not been able to buy himself a recovery. And that's what we're going to have to deal with. That's why we're still in a business cycle. We're still in the downside of the supply shock. And now that demand destruction is happening all over again, and at the same time, the transfers themselves are really winding down, getting back closer to baseline, what does that actually tell us about the state of the economy and the risk to the economy moving forward in 2024, especially as we have to deal with more demand destruction? And that's already baked in. The oil prices are already moved up higher. Is this an economic boom or a Potemkin economy? I took a deeper look at these comparisons between the United States and Europe as they relate to the downside of the supply shock and what that can tell us about the risks to the global economy. That's the video linked below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and Eurodollar University subscribers. Until next time, take care.